Hello and welcome to our St. Mark's online Bible study. This is on the writings and prophets of the post-exilic period. I'm Pastor Edwin Weber, and I'm thrilled that you are joining me as we examine the writings and stories of this critical period in time in biblical history. Today, we're going to be finishing the book of Nehemiah, along with Ezra, which we've covered over the past two sessions. These two books really represent the primary narrative portions of this time period, during which we hear of these stories that are about restoration and rebuilding. Last time we talked about Ezra's innovation concerning the law of Moses, interpreting a blanket ban on so-called foreign marriages. And today we're going to see a little bit about how Nehemiah kind of falls into the same trap of extrapolating additional expectations from God's law. But before that, we're going to be looking at Nehemiah's work on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And the truth is, Nehemiah is actually involved with a variety of different things. So, lots of things that Nehemiah is up to. Last time we started by introducing Nehemiah. We talked about how he was serving as the cupbearer to the Persian king, King Artaxerxes. And because he's there in front of the king and he's distressed about the state of Jerusalem, the king sees him, asks what's bothering him, and eventually, Nehemiah receives the commission from the king to go to Jerusalem to serve as governor and to rebuild the walls around the city. Rebuilding is a major theme in this time, rebuilding both in the figurative and literal sense. It's a big part of what's going on here. And so, again, like rebuilding, restoration, important things. In Ezra, the focus of rebuilding was on the temple. In Nehemiah, the focus is on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And we kind of understand that. Nehemiah is the governor. Ezra's a priest. So the governor is kind of concerned about making sure that the city is walled, that it's protected, and the city itself, to a great degree, is rebuilt. So the first thing Nehemiah does when he arrives in Jerusalem is to rest for 3 days, and then he makes an inspection of the walls. He sort of walks all around them and is able to sort of survey them, figure out what needs to be done. And so the next big thing that happens is that Nehemiah goes and sets about the process of rebuilding the walls. Now in chapter 3, there's a long list of who ends up helping rebuild the walls and what section. You don't have to read all of chapter 3, and on the verses that are on your screen right now, I skipped through it. But if you want to, you can kind of peruse and see what's kind of there. But you might notice Ezra goes section by section. It's very detailed. What section, who rebuilt what section, and it's all listed there in Nehemiah, which is pretty cool. It's a very detailed record. And the thing is, everything's going well. Everybody's volunteering. Everybody's helping out. The wall is rebuilding. And then things go sideways. And based upon what we've already talked about, the types of conflict that God's people were facing, I bet you've already guessed what happened, because it's not all that dissimilar. Just like in Ezra, where Judah's neighbors start grumbling against the business of the Israelites, these other satraps, these other governors, aren't very happy about what's going on in Jerusalem. And so just like in Ezra, where Judah's neighbors frustrate the rebuilding of the temple, again, Nehemiah is all about rebuilding the wall. So it's a very similar situation, right, where these neighboring governors are attempting to frustrate the rebuilding of Nehemiah's walls. And we're actually told that they plan on attacking Jerusalem at one point. And Nehemiah discovers this plot, and so he orders that guards be set, that everybody who's working on the temple, that they be armed when they're doing this. They were really afraid of this surprise attack coming. No doubt this slowed the reconstruction work. You have to think, like, every soldier you have out there protecting them from an attack is one builder less, So it must have made the rebuilding efforts more frustrating, more slow. There's even a line in here where it says, Nehemiah says, and we did not even take our swords off to drink water. It really sort of emphasizing that they felt like they had to be armed the whole time because they were under threat of attack. Now, the interesting thing that appears in this section is we see in chapter 3, I think this is the first time it shows up, but it happens a lot in the book of Nehemiah, is that Nehemiah is interjected with these very brief asides. Sometimes it's just a sentence, sometimes it's just a verse, sometimes a little bit longer, but for a brief moment, Nehemiah will stop the narrative and directly addresses God. So in this case, it's right at the end of chapter 3. You can take a look there where Nehemiah sort of makes this prayerful comment about, concerning the challenges of this day. So, oh Lord, deem me to be upright or righteous before you. Oh Lord, put my enemies to shame. You'll just notice these little interjections of Nehemiah hither and thither. It's interesting that it's part of why we think that Nehemiah comes originally from Nehemiah's own words, his own personal memoir that forms the basis of this book. So as you read, pay close attention to these because they're unique to Nehemiah, and they can perhaps give us a little bit of insight into what Nehemiah was thinking and how did he feel when these events were happening, because they're quite emotional. You really get the impression that he was under a lot of stress and trying to shepherd his people as best he could during those times. Now, the resistance to the efforts to rebuild the walls really sort of come to a head, and they just continue unabated throughout the reconstruction the whole time. And it's kind of as the walls really sort of get towards the completion where everything sort of comes to a head. It's sort of after things, again, it's sort of at this point, depending on how you read it, they've either finished the reconstruction of the walls but haven't dedicated them yet, or they're getting really close to finishing the walls. It's a little ambiguous here. I've already mentioned how not every part of Ezra is in chronological order, so there's a little confusion here. But at this point, Nehemiah actually gets sort of invited out by his adversaries. They're like, oh, let's meet in a neutral ground, away from Jerusalem, away from the protection, right? Nehemiah discerns that it's a trap. So, he doesn't go and participate in that. Later, these adversaries, they end up hiring false prophets to prophesy against Nehemiah to sway him. Later, they write accusatory letters that have no basis. In fact, they just sort of make all of these backhanded suggestions, or they imply different things like, oh, you're building a wall, so surely you must be starting a war against the king. They leap to these conclusions. All of this is done to provoke Nehemiah into doing something rash that could really sort of be brought before the king to use as justification for being opposed to the rebuilding of the walls. And yet, by his own account, to be fair, Nehemiah does acquit himself very well. He never takes the bait, and he really offers a lot of stable leadership, wise leadership during these rebuilding efforts, and ultimately is able to see the walls of Jerusalem completed. This work, which had clearly taken a lot of effort, a lot of time, finally the walls of Jerusalem are finished. Of course, there is a ritual. There's a dedication of the walls. I kind of love this. They start in like a spot, and there are 2 processions around the city with choirs and priests. They end at the temple. Of course, they make lots of sacrifices and praise God. And if you really consider that the primary narrative focus of Nehemiah is on the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, this constitutes the primary narrative arc that we've already looked at. But the thing is, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem might have been Nehemiah's, the thing that he's really focused on, but his work is not yet over. So there are other things that are going on here. Now, one of the most significant things outside of just the main narrative about rebuilding the wall is that there is, we have the dedication, the rededication of the temple in Ezra. Ezra, as a figure, reappears here in Nehemiah, which perhaps suggests that Ezra and Nehemiah, their ministry, their time together, might have overlapped in Jerusalem. We're not 100% sure about that. But Nehemiah tells this story about how God's people ask Ezra to read the law in Jerusalem, to read the law in the temple, and for God's people to sort of rededicate themselves to the covenant. Now, you might recall from many of our previous Bible studies, the reading of the law, the rededication to God's law, is a really important event in ancient Israel. Think about when Samuel invites the people to rededicate themselves to the covenant at Mizpah. Really important event. Think about Josiah. Josiah does the same thing with his reforms in the temple. Invites the people to rededicate themselves. And in fact, the story from Josiah, you'll hear a lot of similarities to what happens here with Ezra as it did with Josiah. Right? So there's this big story. All God's people gather together. Ezra, he's got like a bima, a platform that's made for him to read the law from. And Ezra the priest, he reads the law. There's a group of helpers, a group of other teachers there who we're told interpret what Ezra is saying. It's not exactly clear what it means when they says interpreters, like what is that? So one thought might be that Ezra is reading the law from the Torah, from the classical Hebrew, and perhaps the language of the people had changed enough so that maybe not enough of them had actually known classical Hebrew to understand what was going on. If we think about it today, we might think about it a difference between, say, modern English and, say, Middle English. We could probably pick up a little bit of Middle English and understand it a little bit, but it might require a little bit of interpretation for us. So maybe that's what these interpreters were doing. Another interpretation has been that interpretation of the law is instruction in the law. It's exegesis, it's preaching, it's explanation. So maybe Ezra is reading the law, and these other teachers are as Ezra pauses and stops, they provide interpretation. So the people aren't just listening to the law, they're also listening to the interpretation of God's word. Both are possible. We don't know. It's a little ambiguous here. I'm curious when you read it, what do you think is happening here? Now this is sort of a big event. As Ezra reads the law, they realize they haven't been celebrating booths, so they prepare for the festival of booths. The climax really comes in this section. I know it's a long section. It's 2 chapters I'm asking you to read, basically, but you'll see why I'm having you do that. The climax here is when Ezra prays this long prayer, which recalls God's saving works in the past, generation to generation, which is, as some of us may know, be familiar with, it's a very Jewish way of praying and praising God. Good Jews tell salvation history and all the great things that God has done for God's people and praising God for it. That is the sort of the central germ of a Jewish prayer in many ways. We talked last time about the Penitential Prayer, both prayed by Ezra and later by Nehemiah. So this is another really important prayer, just like Ezra's and to a lesser extent Nehemiah's Penitential Prayer. This prayer frames the question of exile, right? Why did exile happen? What can we do to make sure that it never happens again? So again, think about Ezra's theology, Ezra's philosophy here about why the exile happened. So when you read this prayer, you'll see as Ezra brings up Israel's disobedience and their rebellion against God. And that therefore, as a consequence of that, God hands them over into the hands of their enemies, but that God has been gracious and kind and loving and has saved a remnant. And these are the people that are now left. Now, at the end of all of this, after the rededication and after the reading of the law and Ezra's prayer, we get to the rededication section, right, where God's people rededicate themselves to the covenant. However, what something is really interesting is that it may be interpreted that this is a new covenant, not just a renewal of the old, but something new. And we've already talked a little bit about how Ezra has his own little innovation. Nehemiah does too. So when you read this section in chapter 10, pay attention to the provisions of the covenant. What are God's people signing up? And it's kind of presented as though it's a summation of the law, of the covenant that they're agreed to, but you might notice that there's some differences. There's some things that are emphasized. There are maybe even some innovations in that dedication, that summation of the law. So pay attention real closely as you do that, and see what laws are emphasized, and maybe ask yourself what laws are missing. You might find something interesting there. So they rededicate themselves to the law. There's long sections about everybody who signed, onto the document, basically. And I'm not having you read every little section about who did what, all the genealogies and things like that. Now, in addition to the rededication of the law, so really it's the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem and this rededication, reaffirmation of the law are the two really big focuses and sections of Nehemiah. But Nehemiah is involved in other aspects. In addition to the rededication of the law, just like Ezra, Nehemiah is involved in certain key aspects of enforcing the law of Moses within the land. Now, if you remember, that was part of the command from the Persians to these various local leaders who came back to Judah. Ezra was one of them, right? He was commanded to enforce the law. And now Nehemiah is going to be involved in that as well. When Ezra focuses on Ezra really focuses on one central topic. We talked last time, he's really against foreign marriage. Nehemiah's a little bit different. He has a small collection of several different issues that in his time as governor he ends up addressing. Nehemiah does address foreign marriages to certain other nationalities that are prohibited under the law. But unlike Ezra, he tends to be a little bit more limiting in this area. He's a little more focused about what the law of Moses actually says, and not the blanket banning of all foreign marriages like Ezra. So even between Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a little bit of difference of interpretation. Ezra focuses on that one central topic of foreign marriage. Nehemiah has his collection of different things, right? So one of the other things that Nehemiah engages with is other aspects of the law concerning temple service, which we might call tithes and offerings, the providing of provisions to the temple, to the priest in the temple for the divine service there. The other two issues he sort of addresses is Sabbath observations and debt slavery. Some interesting things here. So let's take a look. Let's tease some of these apart. A lot of these are shorter. They're little, almost more like blips on the radar of Nehemiah's work. But interesting, worthy of us looking at, especially a few of them are really, really interesting in my opinion. We're not going to discuss foreign marriages again. We took a real close look at that last time with Ezra, but to just remember that that's part of what's going on here in Nehemiah 2. However, it's not nearly as important to Nehemiah. There are other things going on. But one of the matters that he does address, and perhaps the most aggressively, I would say, is about Sabbath observation. So you have to think again, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're writing from this period, one single unit. They do agree on a lot. But one of the things they do agree on is, lack of a better way of saying it, they're really interested in strict enforcement of God's law, strict obedience to the law. And that's really a corner piece in their narrative. So we shouldn't be surprised to see that Nehemiah comes with a lot of zeal when it comes to the situation of enforcing the law. And it happens a lot. Some things might make us uncomfortable. Just remember, he's really this is part and parcel of everything that he's about. This strict obedience to the law. So one of these stories is that while Nehemiah is out of Jerusalem for a brief while, there's a Gentile who comes and takes up residency in the temple. And that is forbidden under the Torah, right? The temple is supposed to be a space dedicated just to God's people. So when Nehemiah returns, he sees that this is a violation of the law. He basically evicts the guy. It is just a really brief story. But it's something that's interesting, and I think it shows the zeal that Nehemiah had for this. But remember, last time we looked at a passage from Isaiah chapter 56, which specifically envisioned the presence of Gentiles in the temple. So again, it's important to remember that Nehemiah's position, none of the positions of the prophets or governors were universally accepted at that time. Now, in another section, this is a real section. I might have already asked you to read this, but I just want to point out, we actually get in Nehemiah 6:14 a list of actual people who did oppose Nehemiah on certain things. We now have a lot of clarity about what they were resisting, depending on your interpretation. But in Nehemiah's memoir, they are simply condemned for opposing him. And there's not a lot of understanding for us exactly why. But it's important to interpret the work of the Bible and to see that these perspectives, these opinions, they weren't universal. There was resistance, even among God's people. Nehemiah, of course, doesn't like the resistance he faces. But it was present. It was there. It was always sort of part of what was going on. Another section in chapter 13 concerns the appointment of offerings in the temple for its upkeep. Considering all the challenges faced with the rebuilding of the temple in the book of Ezra, it's probably not surprising to learn that Nehemiah is invested in ensuring that the temple functions properly. It really is part and parcel of this is what the law says, so you ought to do it, and you're not doing it, so therefore, it's got a tone of legalism, but we understand what's going on behind the scenes as well. Brief section worth your attention. Another key part of this ministry of enforcement, you might say, concerns Sabbath observations. We're probably all familiar at this point that the law does instruct us to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Sabbath is a day of rest. It is a memorial for the completion of creation. And an aspect of the law, which of course Nehemiah wants to enforce, is this concept of rest, to abstain from certain activities and certain works. However, in his zeal, maybe Nehemiah goes a bit too far. The law does provide a wide range of regulations and prohibitions on Sabbath work, but Nehemiah takes it a step further, forbidding all forms of commerce on the day of rest. Like Ezra, Nehemiah does a little bit of innovation here concerning God's law. And while it probably doesn't challenge our modern sensibilities quite like foreign marriages, the prohibition on foreign marriages, it still is an addition to God's law, something that I think we should be careful of. So this is all part of Ezra and Nehemiah's wider themes. Again, a higher degree of strictness, right? So it might say, don't do this activity. Nehemiah is going to take it a step further and say, well, don't do any activity on the Sabbath. And the thing is, historically, we know that this was a period of time in which there was a heightened degree of strictness about Sabbath observations. Over time, we see that those lessen. But even when we get to Jesus' day, we see that observing the Sabbath and what that meant was still a huge point of contention between the religious rigorists and some of, shall we say, the more inclusive rabbis. Jesus definitely falls into the latter of those groups. One final area of Nehemiah's work that I want to look at before ending today is his approach concerning debt slavery. So in the ancient world, this was not just the Jews, this was everywhere in the ancient world. There was this issue about slavery, about debt, and about debt slavery, and the way in which the most vulnerable in society were really put to straits. Debt was and still is in many ways today. Debt becomes a cycle, right? It's something in which we can become trapped in. Specifically, this cycle I want to talk about is where an impoverished person basically takes out a loan to pay for basic living needs. Then they have difficulty paying that loan back, so they have to take out more loans. And so what happens is this sort of inescapable cycle of debt. And again, we still have this in our society today. From credit cards to payday lending, we know that there are predatory lending practices that any of us can fall into. But the ones that are most at risk for falling into this trap are the people who are the poorest among us. They're the vulnerable ones. And yet in Nehemiah's day, there was something even worse than being stuck in this cycle of forever debt, which is the practice of debt slavery. If you could not pay off your debt, you might be put into an impossible situation whereby you were forced to sell, and I use air quotes because being forced to sell isn't exactly a voluntary thing, but you could be forced to sell your children, in extreme situations, maybe your spouse or yourself, into slavery to your debtor as collateral, functionally upon defaulting on your loan. And much like the predatory lending practices of today, for many of the lenders, that was the entire point. The entire point was that they did want slaves. They did want people constantly on a leash for their debts. And it was even financially advantageous for people to be dependent on them in their chains of loans. Even if they defaulted, it was oftentimes still profitable for the people who made the loans. Now, as it happens, God's law envisions a way around and beyond debt slavery. In fact, arguably, one beyond even just the whole cycle of debt that we've already sort of addressed. For example, the Torah prohibits lending money for interest. Right? Give a loan, but you can't charge interest for it. That makes a different kind of thing of making a loan. You can't do it for profit. It also makes clear that you are not to lend somebody something that is for their basic needs. You were supposed to give that to the person in need, right? So no loans were supposed to be allowed for things like food or clothing. You were expected to give them to the person in need. And likewise, the practice of selling one's children into slavery was prohibited under God's law, not so much to prevent parents from getting rid of unruly children, as much as it was about prohibiting lenders from kidnapping your children because you could not repay the loan. Now, in Nehemiah's day, the practice of debt slavery had reemerged, along with basically all the predatory lending practices that we've discussed so far. Nehemiah is, of course, all about enforcing God's law, so he works to right these injustices. Perhaps part of the reason that this started back up in the first place was because it was very common. Debt slavery was very common in the ancient world. The Israelites would have been quite unique in this regard to prohibit it. And so these lending practices likely reflect a degree of assimilation with their Gentile neighbors. It also speaks to the desperateness of the situation, right? You would not be selling your children into slavery if you were in a good financial situation. So Nehemiah addresses the issue by making it clear again, right? He enforces the law. He says you can't be selling your children into slavery. You cannot be charging interest for debt. You cannot be seizing people's properties, their livelihood, their farms, because they're in debt to you. So he enforces the law, and then he declares, he's not a priest, he doesn't exactly have this authority, but everyone accepts it. He declares a year of Jubilee. And you might remember those are the Jubilee years, the year in which debts are forgiven, slaves are free, property reverts back to the original owner. So he does a giant economic reset in a sense, and as a result, the enslaved children are returned to their parents. A passage of great joy, which comes to us from Nehemiah, and one of my favorite passages from Nehemiah. So I don't necessarily always like his zeal in enforcing the strictness of God's law, but this passage from Nehemiah 5 is hands down one of my favorite, and I think you will find some delight in it too. So in the end, both Ezra and Nehemiah have key aspects to developing the faith in this post-exilic period. We may not always agree with their positions, and the thing is, again, the prophets, other people, didn't always agree with them. And even at times we can see that the enforcement of the law being done not to the betterment of all. And yet at other times we see the law enforced to the betterment and the care for the poor and the needy. So there's some good things here too. Both Ezra and Nehemiah focus on the story of rebuilding the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. Both face enormous challenges from those who resist and frustrate their rebuilding efforts, but also includes holy dissidence and holy resistance when it comes to enforcing their interpretation of the law. As we've discussed before, these are but two voices among many who were engaged in God's work during this time. We may not like everything that Ezra and Nehemiah has to present us with, but we know that we have to read their stories in context with everything else that was going on during the same time. That's why our next session we are turning toward the prophets from this period, and we'll be hearing some very different perspectives about what restoration means and how to prevent the exile from happening again. But until then, thanks for joining me, and peace be with you.